Good evening. Tuesday evening again, and I'm very glad to have you with us. Tonight we're going to be studying the 11th chapter of John. Would be in page 33. 33 in your notes. And the title of chapter 11 is The Death of Lazarus. Lazarus was a very interesting person. He was related to Jesus, probably first cousins, maybe second cousins. The Hebrew family tree was pretty large, and for lots of good reasons. Probably one of the more significant reasons was because there was no social or public support systems in those days. And so your support system was totally your family. And if your husband died, or you were young and your father died, or something like that, someone in the family needed to come forward and be like a kinsman redeemer and cover you and take care of you. And so a lot of widows depended upon, of course, first of all, their sons, but secondly, if their sons were gone, their family. And so these were pretty well developed family trees. But Lazarus was, nevertheless, he was related to Jesus. He lived in a small village on the other side of the Mount of Olives. And if I can demonstrate with my hands here, again, you remember you have Jerusalem. And in the eastern part of Jerusalem, you had this ridge that looked like a spine. Actually, the whole Zion ridge system formed actually the first letter in the word El Shaddai. And so Jews like to say that God stamped his name on Jerusalem because the first letter of El Shaddai was what we would call a lopsided W. And so you have Jerusalem, and then on the eastern edge of Jerusalem you had this ridge that was about 2 miles long, and that was called Zion. And remember, there's a Zion in heaven, and a heavenly temple sits on Zion, and that's God's temple. And God had Moses in his heart design what was going to eventually be, and Solomon is the one who built it, the temple of God here on earth, that was symbolically and spiritually made to symbolize the temple of God in heaven. So anyway, you have Jerusalem, the eastern side of Jerusalem with Zion, which had the Temple Mount on it, and then you went into a valley that's probably no more than a half mile across, called the Hebron Valley. And on the other side of the Hebron Valley was the Mount of Olives. And at the bottom of the Mount of Olives was the Garden of Gethsemane, which was owned, well, most likely by Joseph of Arimathea, who was a follower and a good friend of Jesus, and he also was a Pharisee. He was one of the believing Pharisees, like Nicodemus. Then, once you came over the top of the Mount of Olives where Jesus went to pray and to be in solitude with the Father, and you came down on the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, within a 2-mile distance was this little village of Bethany. So Bethany was literally on the outskirts of Jerusalem, with the Mount of Olives between it and the major city of Jerusalem. And that's where Lazarus lived. Lazarus had 2 sisters, which also meant they were cousins of Jesus. And they were magnificent women by the name of Mary and Martha. And they were devoted to Jesus, and they were very righteous women. And they really demonstrated the fact that we can have a ministry for the Lord in many, many, many different ways. We're not all meant to be preachers or something like that. And Mary and Martha were good examples of that. Martha was a servant. That's how she expressed her love for people and her love for God. And Martha would cook and clean and serve people all the time. She was a worker. Mary was more contemplative and more bent on prayer and spiritual searching for more of the wonders of God. And so Mary was quiet and spiritual, where Martha was active and a servant. Very different ways, but at the same time both loving ministries towards Jesus and towards God's people. And it's a beautiful example. So Mary and Martha were very close in age and very close in affection for each other, but yet very different people. That's important to know. So Jesus is up in the Galilee, which we remember is up in here, up in here, and Mary and Martha and Lazarus are down here in Jerusalem, just south of Jerusalem in Bethany. So there's about 70 miles between the two of them, and that's important to know about the story. Okay, so with that background, let's look at the story. In chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, a village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love, Lazarus, is sick." Now, it mentions here an event that maybe many of you have heard of, where Mary anointed Jesus' feet, really in preparation for burial, with very expensive spices and perfumes. The Bible says about a year's wages, so very expensive. I think here it is giving you a reference of a future event. Mary will do this later on in the week, but I don't think she did it twice. it would be enormously expensive and beyond what they could afford. Plus, it's an event that you would do once. It's an anointing. Once anointed, always anointed. And so this is a reference to what Mary would do. And it's very much a part of Mary to devote all this money that she had to buy these perfumes and spices and to anoint and wash Jesus's feet and wipe it off with her hair as an act of devotion in preparation for Jesus' burial, which was going to be in about a week. So that's the story. Starting in verse 4. When he heard this, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death, nor is it for God, no, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Remember, I said he was up in the Galilee, which is roughly 70 miles away. And that's an interesting thing. Usually when you hear of a loved one who is very, very ill and possibly dying, you rush to see them, and yet Jesus hesitates. It's a very interesting point, and only the heart of Jesus would have understood this at the time. And the disciples wondered, why are we waiting?
7.
Thank you, hon. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." That's after 2 days. So they're going to start their trip after 2 days being in the Galilee to head down south to Judea. And the disciples said, "But Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." Yeah, Jesus is talking in spiritual terms here. The light that he is referring to is his own light, the light of the world, the light of God. And so Jesus is basically answering them, I would be afraid if I didn't have the light, if I didn't have my God, my Father. But since I do, I have no fear of stumbling. And so Jesus is making a spiritual answer for their physical question. And Jesus did not fear capture and abuse by the Pharisees, because it was not the will of the Father for that to happen yet. And so nothing could touch Jesus. And remember, we've had incidences in the past here in John where Pharisees have plotted or actually began to take action to have an attack upon Jesus and just be stopped. Not by a physical force or a natural force, but they just can't do it. And that's because the will of God stopped them. And Jesus will not give up his life until it is his will to give up his life for your salvation. And that time hadn't come yet. It'll be an interesting point a little bit later too, that we'll go back to that. So just keep that in mind.
11.
Thank you, hon. In verse 11, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. Again, the disciples, thinking of this in natural context, are not going to understand what Jesus is going to do. And in verse 12, the disciples reply, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking to them of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So Jesus is intending to not rescue Lazarus from death, but to literally bring Lazarus back from the dead. And this is a very important point. I just won't make it now. In the Hebrew faith, and it's kind of an interesting concept, and I'm sure there are a number of people who accept this as part of their belief system. The Hebrews during their time believed that when a person died, their soul lingered around the body for 4 days. And it was possible for the soul to be directed by God to go back into the body and the person be revived. An interesting point. So if Jesus had gotten there before Lazarus died, people that were enemies of Jesus would say, well, Lazarus was going to recover anyway. And if Jesus saved his life. And if Jesus got there early after the death and within that 4-day period of time, they would have said, well, the credit belongs with the soul re-entering the body. Jesus just happened to be there when that happened. And so in both cases, the enemies of God would have rational arguments to diminish the credit of Jesus' power and authority to raise people from the dead. And of course, the most perfect example of that is when God raises Jesus himself from the dead, as Paul calls Jesus the first fruit. This is an important issue, and so Jesus intentionally waits to be late down there so that the enemies of God would have no argument. They would have no basis for anything. And so if he waited 2 days and then started the 70-mile journey, you can see that would take a matter of days to walk 70 miles. I don't know. I've never walked 70 miles, and I don't intend to. But at the same time, it would take, I would think, 3 to 5 days to walk 70 miles. So that's why Jesus did this. The disciples did not understand this at the time, but they will understand it in a small amount of time.
Verse 14.
Thank you. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there. And you see, they didn't really understand that, but now we do, because we understand the Jewish belief in the 4-day period, and also the belief that he might have recovered him by himself, and Jesus just happened to be there. So Jesus tells him, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, we just as well go with him, that we may die with him. And so the disciples thought that, not understanding the real power and authority yet of Jesus, and you can imagine that, we wrestle all the time understanding the fact that Jesus' power has no limit. And so anything natural that you would say would be an issue is certainly nothing to Jesus. So Jesus is totally supreme, everlasting to everlasting. But the disciples were still in the process of becoming aware of the limitless power of God. So in verse 17, Jesus comes across the sisters. On his arrival, Jesus found Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. See, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. So Bethany being a very small town, and Lazarus was an outstanding man and a righteous man and a leader, he and his sisters were fairly well known throughout the region. And so people, a large group of people, came to them to comfort them and to mourn for them, and to also pray for them, because mourners would stay after the funeral for 4 days to try to pray the soul back into the body. And so this was a very common thing. So there was a number of people that had come, a large number. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Most likely, being Mary, probably praying with the others. Martha went out to see Jesus. Jesus was on the outskirts of the town, probably in some sort of a public park or place where he and his disciples could camp. And so Martha goes out to meet him. Verse 21, Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection in the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Notice that Jesus does not say, I am a life. He says, I am the life. He is the source of all life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called to her sister, Mary, the teacher is here, and he's asking for you. When Mary heard this, being that she had stayed in the home and with the prayer group that was surrounding the home. She got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at a place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It's so interesting to notice the devotion and the power of the strength of these two sisters' faith, that they both said the same thing. If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died, which was very true. But Jesus wanted to take away from the Pharisees and the Pharisaical Jews the argument that he would have recovered anyway. And you can see that point. Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Bethany being a small community which has survived to today, there is still a Bethany on the eastern side of Jerusalem. And they have a tomb in the town that is believed to be accurately the tomb of Lazarus, where he's going to come out with a lot of the grave clothes still on. So I think to us it would appear that we were looking at a mummy as he comes out of the tomb. And the tomb is at ground level with a small staircase, stone staircase going down to it. So Lazarus literally came up the staircase, almost symbolic of a burial and a resurrection, going down into the tomb, coming back out of the tomb. Verse 36. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? See how Jesus loved Lazarus? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Now there was a criticism. Why didn't Jesus come earlier and save his life? Well, those were believers, and they didn't understand that Jesus was acting out this miracle for the salvation of his enemies. His people, the children of God, the believers in Jesus, they didn't need this acted out because they knew it. Both Mary and Martha said, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. So Jesus is distinctly doing this miracle for the sake of the unbelievers. I think that would be true as of today, that Jesus has such a heart, and he wants us to have such a heart for the unbelieving people of the world. Jesus not only loves his children, but he loves those that have not chosen to be his children. So that's what Jesus is doing here.
38.
Thank you. Jesus, once more, deeply moved, came to the tomb, and it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, as it would be Martha thinking about the comfort of other people around there. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me." And this is an important point that Jesus is making to us. The fact that God always hears us. There's an incident in Daniel which speaks directly to this. It's in Daniel 10, verse 12. All right. Daniel is praying for God's help in the conditions of what the Persian king needs. And he prays for like 21 days and doesn't receive an answer. And in verse 12, the angel has come. Actually, in verse 11, the angel says to Daniel, he says, "Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm going to speak to you, and stand up, for I have been sent to you." And when he said this to me, I stood up trembling. Then he continued, "Do not be afraid, Daniel." Listen to this. "Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince and the princes here are princes of darkness. They're like lieutenants in Satan's army. It says, "The prince of Persia resisted me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes of heaven, came to help me because I was detained there by the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what has happened to your people, what will happen to your people in the future. For this is a vision that is concerning a time that is yet come." And I think that's a perfect example of the fact that we live in a world of spiritual warfare. Satan roams the earth. Jesus' kingdom, the kingdom of God, is the third kingdom. And the second kingdom is where the spiritual warfare takes place. And Satan is constantly attempting to trick you, to get you to stumble, to get you to look the wrong way. A lot of times there's a warfare that goes on between the person who is praying and the answering of the prayer. And Jesus is announcing to his Father that he perfectly knows that his Father always hears him and will answer. But he knows that Satan will make every attempt possible to come between the person praying and the answer.
$11.42.
42, thank you, hon. And in verse 42, I knew that you always heard me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you've sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And this is the story of Jesus' resurrection of his friend and cousin, Lazarus. Now, let's look at the reaction that the people have. And I've told you before, and I want to emphasize it again, because it's so important that each and every one of us understand the warfare that goes on inside of us. And that is the warfare between your character, which is being built up by God through righteousness to make you a child of God, and your own selfish side that is constantly looking for an advantage. We'll call that your will. And so each and every one of us have this spiritual warfare that goes on our entire life between building up the strength of our godly character and resisting the forces that Lucifer, Satan, puts on our will. And the question is, does a person make his decisions in life, his choices in life? Are we going to make them on the basis of what our character tells us is right and follow the ways of righteousness? Or are we going to listen to our will and do what we believe is our best interest, what helps me, what's good for me? The old question, what's in it for me? And so we always have what we would call the selfish side of us, the side that's always looking, that's greed, that's bitter, that is jealous, is always looking for an advantage over the side that is telling us, our character, that's telling us the righteous way to make decisions. These are the Pharisaical Jews and Pharisees themselves. And so what do? Jesus performed this remarkable miracle of bringing a man back to life that they knew died and was dead for more than 4 days. So it was impossible for them to reason any excuses. That's why Jesus waited to go, is to confront the unbelief of these people. And so what did they do? Therefore, and I'm in verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sanhedrin is this council that controls the Pharisees, who control the culture of Israel. What are we accomplishing here? These Pharisees speak to themselves. They asked, "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs." They know he does what is impossible for man to do. If we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation, which is a political platform that they're developing as a rationality to oppose Jesus and his righteousness and his miraculous life. 49. Then one of them, a man named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. And he says, "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that of the whole nation will perish." Now it's interesting because Caiaphas was plotting the murder of Jesus, and he is now here trying to give the act that he's plotting a spin on why it's necessary. It's necessary to kill Jesus to save Israel. And that's the rationale he's using on his fellow Pharisees to keep them in line. You got to do this to save Israel. And it's nothing but a front to excuse his own evil.
51.
51. He did not say this on his own. That's Caiaphas. John is telling you he did not say this on his own. But as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. More of Caiaphas' spin. I'm going to prophesy that Jesus is going to die for the nation. And not only that nation, but also for the scattered people of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Now, the interesting part about this last thing is a good question about lies. Lying can sound rational, and lying can have little pieces, bits and pieces of truth stuck in the lie to give the lie a position. And that's what Caiaphas is doing. And that's the caution we need to take on a lie. Just because a lie makes sense doesn't make it true. And just because a lie has some truth in it does not make it righteous. And so these are the things that Caiaphas was doing to keep the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin in order, that he could control the whole position. Okay, so verse 54. Therefore Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. Now it's an interesting point here. Ephraim, as probably many of you know, is one of the tribes of Israel. And Ephraim Here's a very good map of Israel itself.
Thank you, Billy.
Here's Samaria. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Jordan River. Here's the Dead Sea. Here's Jerusalem. Ephraim is a territory right about in the middle of Israel. But that's not, the name is the same, but that's not where Jesus went. It says he went into the desert places, which would be below Jerusalem and below Judea, in an area which is called today and called then the Negev. And this was a village down in this area where Jesus went. It would be quiet, it would be isolated, there would be very little Roman activity, and of course the Pharisees, being big city people, wouldn't be very strong or influential in a place like this in the wilderness.
55.
Thank you. 55. So that's the village of Ephraim. 55. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, which would be like late March, many went up from the country of Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. Remember, the Jews did not understand and did not practice baptism, which is a washing away of the old and the moving towards the new, the death of your old self and the resurrection of your new self. Baptism, the cleansing and the washing, was a ceremonial thing that Jews did. It's like taking a bath before you go to a meeting or something like that. You cleanse off the dirt of the world and make yourself clean when you go to meet God in the temple. And that's what people were doing. Verse 56. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he going to come to the feast at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it so that they might arrest him. Now, it's an interesting point here where Jesus changes tactics and where he had gone right in the midst of people who wanted to stone him, knowing his protection, and now he's cautious. And I think you need to understand what Jesus said when he was in the wilderness being tempted by Lucifer, Satan. And Jesus told him, "Do not tempt your God." And so we all walk in a state of sanctification where we are under the protection and live in harmony with the Holy Spirit. And there is a protection that comes with that. But Jesus cautions us to not be excessive about that, to want to show off, to say, I can take chances, I can risk a lot of things because I'm protected. And I believe that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is now, since the attempts the plots to attempt to kill Jesus are coming into a state of more reality, that the priests are actually plotting gangs that will go out and murder Jesus, that since this is getting to be more direct, that Jesus is not going to tempt his Father by continuing to risk his life by doing these things. And so it's not, on Jesus's part, it's not a form of fear. It's a form of respect and honoring his Father. I'm not going to go out of my way to risk myself so that you will have to come and shield me. And that's the way Jesus saw it. And so Jesus becomes more conservative in his life. We have a few minutes. Let's start chapter 12. Now, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived. Now, this is after he's risen Lazarus from the dead, and Lazarus is a healthy man walking around in Bethany, and everybody's seeing him. Where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served. That's her love language. That's how she shares the ministry of God. While Lazarus was among the reclining at the table with him. When Mary took, and here is the event, Mary took about a pint of pure nard, which was a highly priced, highly valued perfume, an expensive perfume, and poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas of Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did, and this is John's comment. John, who understands a lot of the heart of Judas. And John says he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was in the money bag. So, in other words, I think part of Judas's motive was just to try to discredit the beautiful, loving thing that Mary did for Jesus here. That's part of it. And the other part of it is he wanted the money to go into the purse so he'd have more money to slip out of there and into his own pocket. And so Judas always had two sides to him. He always had this cynical side, suspicious side, always looking for what's wrong with something, always looking for anything that he could make into a flaw. And so Judas had problems all this time. And I want you to see what Jesus said to it.
7.
Verse 7, leave her alone. Jesus replied, it was meant that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, true, because we live in a world of nature, and we live in a world of chance. but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there, and they came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Get this. So the chief priest made plans to kill Lazarus as well, and then deny the whole miracle. You see how their will became the driving force in their life and led every one of them straight into the pit of hell. The things that the will wants for you can sometimes be good, but you also have to worry about the treachery of the will.
11.
Verse 11, and we'll finish. For on account of him, many of the Jews, the account of Lazarus' resurrection from the dead, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. This is a beautiful place to stop, because Jesus is in Bethany. He will go back the 2 miles and up to the Mount of Olives and down to the Garden of Gethsemane in preparation of his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The prophecy is always that the light of God will enter through the east gate. And that's exactly what Jesus will do. And we'll study that next week. God bless you. Thank you so much for being with us. Amen.